Welcome back to Gladio Free Europe. I am Liam, joined as always by Russian Sam.
Hello.
And a returning champion, the incredible Florida cracker himself, Jackson from Jacksonville. You know him, Grace Cathedral Park. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to talk about the land of my birth.
Yeah. If any of you guys listening are not familiar, Jackson here is from North Florida. I have spent most of my life in South Florida. I've moved around a lot, but I think Miami is really home for me, and it's a place that I really want to get into. I think, together, the two of us might be able to figure out what exactly is going on in Florida's weirdest state. Russian Sam, you have never been to Florida, have you? Or just once or twice?
No, I have been to Florida. I had the typical tourist experience where it's like, you go to Miami, you go to the beaches, you go to Orlando, You go to Disney World, you go to the swamps, you see the gators, etc. But I was a kid. It's been a while.
Yeah, okay. So that's good. So we all have some experience here, but with this territory. We've been working on this episode for a while. There's a lot to get into, as you're going to see just by the episode cat length here. Florida is really a remarkable and strange place. It's wonderful. It's contemptible. It really presents a lot of historical paradoxes. I think the most fundamental of all of these is that Florida is, at the same time, first part of the contiguous United States to have been charted by any European explorer, and yet it is the last part of the United States to have really been settled by Europeans. It is today the third largest state by population, but less than a century ago, it was only the 31st. This growth is entirely due to recent and ongoing attempts to tame the natural landscape, draining the wetlands to build endless subdivisions and chopping down the pine rocklands and cypress domes to lay down active living communities and luxury golf resorts. A lot of this growth is also related to the cities of Miami and Orlando, that together have a combined metro population of 9 million people. These cities, however, only exist due to one of the biggest and least discussed demographic shifts in U.S. history, as people from all over the United States and across the Caribbean and Latin America flocked to these new cities established on the edge of America's final frontier, that being the wetlands of the Florida Everglades. Jackson, so we really did this whole thing, we're anticipating as a multi-part series in conjunction with you and your research. What exactly is your thesis here about Florida history?
Yeah, I just think that Florida is super interesting to study, and I think that it is maybe worth studying for people who are not from here or have never been, just because it's sort of simultaneously the most American state. Like when you think of sort of the kinds of things that happen in America, it's the sort of Florida man stuff, and
yes.
Orlando obviously has Disney World, which has like Main Street USA and all that kind of stuff. So it is simultaneously one of the most American states in the country, but also like its history is very, very unique from the rest of America. It sort of doesn't follow the same patterns as even other southern states, especially not other states in other regions. And not only is it sort of unique in that regard, but it's also constantly shifting, and it's changed sort of the landscape as well as the socioeconomic and political landscape of the state has changed a lot throughout its history.
Yeah, my impression is that it's sort of post-American in a very strange way, where on the one hand, it's like the oldest continuously settled by European parts of the United States, while simultaneously it's running away from its history. It's the refuge of Republicans from all over the country in the last few years, but simultaneously it's just a complete ahistorical pastiche that you can just project anything you want onto it. So it's just very postmodern.
Yeah, and I think that's only because there have been so many recent cultural and demographic changes since the beginning of the 20th century, basically. But I think that the idea that Florida is ahistorical, I think that's wrong. And as we're going to see, there are elements of the earlier Florida colonial society that are still there in Florida today. But I think that because Florida is, the first appendage of mainland America to have been trod upon by the conquistadors, and because it has this incredibly deep history that is not necessarily peripheral to the rest of the history of the Americas, Florida is very overlooked. And I'd like to think that by really getting into the history of this state, we might be, filling a gap in a lot of people's people's historical awareness, even people who are otherwise quite well read about the history of the United States and the history of Latin America. So this episode is really going to focus on colonial Florida, which is the 300-odd year period beginning with Ponce de Leon's expedition in 1513 up to the American annexation of 1821. You could even push the boundary of the colonial period as late as, statehood in 1845, or even with the draining of the Florida wetlands in the late 19th century. But I think, 1821, Adams-Onis Treaty, good place to stop here. During this 300-year period, Florida would experience enormous political and demographic changes, probably more than any other territory in the United States. However, the hostile terrain and the presence of malaria-bearing mosquitoes meant there would never be any successful major presence of colonial settlers in Florida. This is a huge difference from New England, from the South, from basically anywhere else in the United States up until the late 19th century. Importing or imposing Old World societies, as has been done elsewhere in the English colonies and to an extent in the Spanish colonies, would not be possible in Florida. Colonizers were forced to reckon with local indigenous peoples and indigenous powers. This means for a moment in the 18th and early 19th centuries, European immigrants were often really immigrants into indigenous nations, especially the Creek and the Seminole. Many of these indigenous peoples actually eagerly welcomed colonial settlers into their ranks. But this time of the Seminoles is still a long way away. Let's really get into earlier beginnings of Florida before Europeans arrived, looking at the deep history and geography of what is today the Sunshine State. Russian Sam, take us away.
So Florida, it's a periphery of America, but only in the geographic sense. It's an appendage to the United States that was, for millions of years, just an island. It takes about 6 hours to drive from Miami to the tip of the peninsula up in Jacksonville at the base. So this was a pretty big island. And that's assuming that you don't run into any sudden rainstorms or pull into any massive rest stops on the I-95. Florida is so long that it contains multiple distinct latitudinal zones. The climate of South Florida, to say nothing of the culture, is much closer to the Caribbean than the rest of the state, with genuinely tropical weather that allows for exotic flora and fauna, like bananas and iguanas. All these things thrive in Florida, as people who have been there can attest, often to the detriment of native wildlife. But interestingly, one of the most iconic plants of South Florida, the coconut, is one that was introduced probably around 500 years ago by the conquistadors over from Panama. The coconut is not native to Panama either, interestingly. Instead, the Caribbean coconut crossed the Pacific at some point in the last few millennia, either floating across thousands of miles of ocean currents or carried deliberately by ancient Austronesian sailors who made sporadic contact with Native America. It's very much a global history there. But most of this episode will focus much less on South Florida and more on the temperate part of the state, because for various historical, geographic, and climatic reasons, South Florida, and in particular Southeast Florida, which is where Miami is now, was since the beginning of human habitation the least populous part of the peninsula. This is pretty remarkable given that today the situation has completely reversed, thanks largely to air conditioning and anti-malarial drugs and the massive hydrological projects that drained the vast majority of the Everglades, one of the most fascinating natural features of the United States today.
Yeah, because basically all of South Florida is a wetland. It's technically a slow-moving river that flows out of the massive and exceptionally shallow Lake Okeechobee. Until the construction of drainage canals in the late 19th century, the lake naturally formed a gradient with the swampy Everglades, flowing all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and from there to the Caribbean. Basically, all dry land south of Lake Okeechobee amounts to clusters of tree islands and raised limestone ridges. Most of these dry areas on the coast were also dominated by vegetation extremely difficult to pass through. Miles upon miles of saw palmetto that will turn your legs into sliced ham, and forests of impenetrable mangrove trees. When U.S. settlers attempted to tame this frontier over a century ago, they nearly destroyed one of the most unique American ecosystems, which contains within it one of the most important carbon sinks on the continent. We should mention, however, that the wild landscape of Florida isn't going without a fight. Decades of devastating hurricanes can be seen as nature's attempt to throw down all the plans of the settlers and return South Florida to its swampy, stinky roots. Driving up through central Florida, you'll notice seemingly endless numbers of natural lakes created by the extremely low elevation, high water table and constant rainstorms. Many of these lakes flow into the St. Johns River, including the primary source of that river, the incredibly named Lake Helen Blazes. I think the St. Johns is, like Florida in general, really interesting, really underdiscussed by historians and geographers. It's one of the longest waterways in the United States, and its abundant fish have fed human life for over 10,000 years. Its course goes from the Orlando and Sanford area northward to Jacksonville, the hometown of our dear guest on this episode.
Yeah, and as the sort of St. John's flows up, you start to flow, and it is one of the only rivers that flow south to north, as people who are from there will often tell you. It was one of the first things I learned. As Central Florida becomes northern Florida, the swampy wetland landscape sort of slowly transitions into a more normal southern pine forest climate that is more recognizably southern than the rest of the state is. North of Tampa, up to around Gainesville, the landscape even shows some characteristics of prairie or savanna with large, clear areas of scrubland and grasslands that are and were perfect for raising cattle, which was Florida's major economic concern until the mass introduction of citrus around the middle of the 19th century. The panhandle in the area around Jacksonville in northeastern Florida is more reminiscent of the fertile soils of the rest of the American Deep South and was the state's major cotton-producing region before the 1860s. This obviously had major socioeconomic and political effects on the state, but it's also the reason that the Panhandle is the most culturally southern part of the state, even to this day. It's, however, important to remember that Florida's natural landscape is and always has been changing for both natural and human reasons. None of these descriptions held true even 6,000 years ago. Florida used to have a much drier and much cooler climate, and the Native Americans who lived in Florida lived in these conditions for hundreds of years before the changing climates made the South wetter, hotter, and less inhabitable. In a sense, people have always been trying to live in Florida's natural environment as it went through various and fairly rapid changes in climate, and they've pretty much always struggled to deal with the massive swings in precipitation and temperature that those changes can bring along.
And I think it's interesting that even though Florida is geographically remote compared to the rest of the United States, ancient ancestral Native Americans arrived in the peninsula basically immediately after crossing over from Asia.
The first Florida men.
Yes, the original Florida men were Paleo-Indians from the Clovis culture who chased giant sloths down the peninsula as early as 15,000 years ago, before the Everglades even existed. The subsequent Archaic period saw the cold climate of the southeast get a lot wetter and hotter, as Jackson said, as the great North American glaciers began to retreat. However, due to some good luck and favorable geology, Florida is actually really key to understanding the entire Archaic period of indigenous history, because there are some really remarkable finds here. Some of you guys might remember that we discussed ancient Florida once briefly in passing in episode 67 on the bog bodies. We mentioned there's a peat bog outside Orlando, which preserves the bodies of over 150 ancient Native Americans from the Archaic period, mostly from around 5000 BC. These bodies of men, women, and children actually represent a majority of all Native American remains found in the Archaic period anywhere in North America, which I think is really just kind of staggering. The bodies at this site, Windover Pond outside Orlando, were carefully interred, wrapped in blankets, and held down in the shallow waters with stick frames, remarkably similar to the bog bodies of Europe. But because Florida is a lot warmer than the chilly wetlands of Denmark, a lot more decomposition occurred on these bodies. Still, some patches of tissue were recovered, which would be unthinkable in a drier burial site that was 7,000 years old. According to DNA analysis, the people at Windover had a distant Northeast Asian origin, just like other Native American groups, but did not appear to have any ancestral links to later Florida Native Americans of ensuing millennia. I think this is a good reminder that the kind of, extreme cultural and demographic shifts that have happened in Florida have been happening since 5000 BC. But despite that, distinction in culture and genetics, the material culture and the lifestyles of the Windover people had much in common with the groups we're about to discuss, later Native American groups. Just like later Native American groups, the people at Windover hunted with atlatls, spear throwers widely used among the Archaic period, but with a much longer life in Florida than elsewhere. And despite the fact that these Windover people lived inland, they made heavy use of shark's teeth as scraping and piercing tools. something else they have in common with their successors, the Tequesta and Calusa. Moving on casually by about 7,000 years.
As one does.
Juan Ponce de Leon is today one of the best known explorers or conquistadors of the Spanish colonial era. Probably third in the American imagination, just behind Christopher Columbus and Hernan Cortez. But this wasn't always the case. Ponce de Leon did not conquer any great empires. He didn't bring any prosperous new territories into the Spanish grip. He was unsuccessful at pacifying or converting any large numbers of indigenous peoples. The only part of the former Spanish Empire to consider him a figure of any great note is Puerto Rico, who today see him as one of their founding fathers. But he did do something that mattered a lot more in hindsight than it did at the time. He discovered Florida. Ponce de Leon's early life is mostly unknown, except that he was certainly an unimportant member of a very important family in the south of Spain. He may very well have been the son of the second Count of Arcos, a local aristocrat also named Juan Ponce de Leon. The evidence here is circumstantial as well as statistical. The Count had the same name as him, and he also happened to have 21 illegitimate children. So good odds that one of them is our guy. Regardless of who exactly Ponce's parents were, he was certainly related to a lot of important aristocrats across the Kingdom of Castile. He served as a page to the headmaster of the Crusading Order of the Knights of Calatrava. And although he was not knighted properly, he took part in the conquest of Granada in 1492. This was the war that made Catholic Spaniards the masters of the Iberian Peninsula. Not satisfied with expelling and marginalizing Jews and Muslims after this conquest, men like Juan Ponce de Leon then turned their sabers outwards toward non-Christian peoples living in North Africa and shortly thereafter, the Caribbean.
According to the early histories, after the end of the Spanish Reconquista, Ponce de Leon, who was probably still a teenager at that point, joined the second voyage of Christopher Columbus to the island of Hispaniola, which today encompasses the countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and the first piece of the New World to be controlled by any European crown. It was during this second voyage that Columbus began the mass enslavement of the indigenous Taino peoples. There is really no argument against this being a genocide. In just 30 years, the population of the island shrunk by some 90%, caused by a combination of overwork, disease, suicide, and outright murder by the Spanish. Ponce de Leon's involvement in these initial atrocities is unknown, but a decade later, in 1503, he would lead a massacre so brutal that one of his own men, Bartolomeo de las Casas, would be convinced to spend the rest of his life advocating against the abuse of Native Americans.
Yeah, and so 5 years after this massacre, Ponce de Leon left Hispaniola for the yet unconquered island of Puerto Rico, which at this time was contested between Taino and Carib peoples, who spoke different languages and practiced very different lifestyles. The Taino were farmers who lived in permanent villages with organized temples and ball courts in the Mesoamerican fashion. Meanwhile, the Caribs were mobile raiders who came up from the Orinoco River of Venezuela. The Caribs were so notorious for their eating habits that they inspired a new word, cannibalism, and of course gave us our name for the Caribbean Sea. Historians have been debating the veracity of these cannibal allegations for centuries, especially because the Spanish used these allegations to justify genocidal violence against not only the Caribs, but all indigenous peoples of the Americas. However, it is now generally believed that cannibalism did exist among the peoples of the Caribbean. However, there's no reason to believe that the Taino were any less likely to eat their enemies than the Caribs in certain contexts. We should also keep in mind that the most well-attested stories of cannibalism in the Spanish Caribbean was actually cannibalism by and of Europeans. Stories of stranded sailors doing the unthinkable when they crashed on some deserted isle, including, as we'll see, the Florida Keys, very common site for shipwrecks.
Yeah, so Ponce de Leon was particularly eager to spread tales of Carib cannibalism because of his clever alliance with the weaker Taino people of Puerto Rico. And just like Hernan Cortez later in the 16th century, he used dogs to hunt and kill indigenous people across the islands in a systemic campaign of extermination. Within just a few years, the Carib peoples of Puerto Rico had been destroyed almost to a man, with some survivors fleeing across the sea to the Bahamas, Cuba, and possibly Florida. He was named as the first governor of Puerto Rico, but he ended up losing a political battle to Diego Colon, the son of Christopher Columbus. This seems to have been preferable to Ponce, as he was more interested in exploring and conquering new lands than he was in dealing with the dull aftermath of colonial governance. So initially he would set sail to the Lucayan Islands, today better known as the Bahamas. Supposedly this was home to the most beautiful woman in the world. The Bahamas were an important trading center for the peoples of the Caribbean and the peoples of Florida. It's very possible that here in the Bahamas, the Spanish first learned of the mighty Calusa of the Gulf Coast, but we'll get to them eventually. He certainly learned about a gold-rich land west of the which the Spanish later reworked into the name of the island Bimini in the Bahamas. Historians think that Bimini could have referred to either Florida nearby or to the Yucatan Peninsula of the Maya, hundreds of miles to the west. We don't know what exactly the peoples of the Bahamas told Ponce de Leon that made him so interested in these new lands, but it probably wasn't the Fountain of Youth.
Right. So today, the only thing most Americans know about Ponce de Leon, besides the fact that he explored Florida, is that he was searching for the Fountain of Youth. And stories about Ponce de Leon and the Fountain of Youth began circulating very quickly after his initial voyage. However, somewhat miraculously, Ponce de Leon's own ship's log from his voyage survives, and there is no mention of the mythical fountain. This makes it pretty unlikely that he actually was looking for this. But that isn't to say that nobody in his time and place believed such a thing existed, or that it could be in Florida. Probably originating in Islamic stories about Alexander the Great, which in themselves draw from Herodotus, the Fountain of Youth was one of many medieval folkloric elements that Europeans transported with them to the Americas. We can compare this to the belief that they were going to find Welsh Indians descended from Prince Madoc, who, sailed west and disappeared, or that there was a Christian king named Prester John somewhere in the New World. This was part of this, medieval mindset that was being applied into this rapidly changing world. However, not everybody thought the Fountain of Youth was a real thing. One of the first references to Ponce de Leon looking for this fountain was the Italian writer Peter Martyr, who was dismissive of all conquistadors as foolish adventurers. He might have included this as a way to show how stupid Ponce de Leon was. He believed that such a thing could exist. Regardless, stories about the Fountain of Youth would become essential to Florida boosterism for the next 500 years. I'm not sure if the Villages would be America's largest retirement community if hordes of readers in Elizabethan London were not convinced that this peninsula had magical, rejuvenating powers. I can't find any specific example of any individual colonizer going to Florida because they believed the Fountain of Youth would be there, but because this was a widely believed myth, I gotta think at least some of these guys, deep down, hoped they were going to find this fountain. Regardless, Ponce and his crew saw the coast of the peninsula in April 1513, initially mistaking it for an island. I was shocked in the research of this episode to learn that they did not see any flowers, because Florida at this time would have been an imposing and nearly impenetrable matrix of mangroves and saw palmetto, with some skinny pines and sable palm trees swaying in the breeze. They named this place Florida not for any romantic reason, but because it happened to be an obscure Catholic holiday that day, Pascua Florida, Easter of the Flowers, part of the lead up to Easter. After a short initial exploration near modern-day Cape Canaveral, in which Ponce de Leon found no people and no riches, and certainly no Fountain of Youth, he got back on his ship and sailed south to what is today Jupiter. Here, he did encounter some local Indians, and after a scuffle in which Ponce insists the native attacked first, a local man from an unknown tribe was captured and forced to be a guide. They then sailed further south through Biscayne Bay, making little note of the area that is today Miami, and went all the way through the Keys and the Straits of Florida into the Gulf of Mexico. And here, Ponce and his crew unknowingly entered the territory of the mighty Calusa.
Now, the Calusa were very different from the people that Ponce's expedition had encountered. These peoples of the Gulf Coast were immediately interested in the Spanish and eager to make contact. A group of Calusa women were so bold that they grabbed hold of the anchor of Ponce's ship and tried to drag it to shore. The Spaniards then made the mistake of capturing some of these women, presumably with nefarious intent. In an interesting parallel to English colonization, a Spanish-speaking Taino living among the Calusa introduced himself to Ponce and offered to introduce him to the Calusa formally. This translator invited Ponce to meet with the Calusa leader, whom Ponce recorded as being named Carlos. Spaniards took great note of the similarity this had with the name of their own monarch, Carlos V. Confusingly, later Spaniards would describe all Calusa as the Carlos people. Ponce and his men would describe Carlos as a king rather than a chief, and the Calusa as a feudal state rather than a tribe. This translator promised that if Ponce met the king, he would be able to purchase huge quantities of gold. Probably at this moment, Ponce believed that he he had found the golden island of Bimini. This meeting was set to take place on Estero Island, which very astute listeners may remember as the later home of the Confederations, who certainly believed that Florida was conducive to eternal life. But the meeting never actually happened. The Calusa, who had surely heard stories of Spanish violence from their Taino translator, lay in wait with 20 war canoes, some of them double boats lashed together like a Polynesian outrigger. When Ponce's ships came into range, the Calusa shot a hail of arrows tipped with shark teeth, killing one Spaniard. A few brave warriors attempted to board the ship, but were immediately cut apart with sabers or taken prisoner. According to Douglas T. Peck, a professional seafarer and well-regarded amateur historian, some of the Calusa war canoes were actually made with Mexican wood. Additionally, Maya artifacts have been found in a few shell mounds. This suggests that the Calusa might have wanted to capture Ponce's ship to more easily command trade with Mesoamerica. To what extent there was oceaning trade in the pre-Columbian period is still a matter of conjecture, but historians are increasingly convinced that indigenous merchants did sail from one side of the Gulf of Mexico to the other.
Yeah, let's kind of pause on Ponce here for a second and look more at the Calusa. Jackson, I feel like going to school in Florida, at least in southern Florida, the Calusa are basically the only Native Americans you learn about. Was that your experience as well?
So actually, I'm not really sure that I ever learned about the Calusa in school. The two that come up in sort of North Florida context are obviously the Seminole come up a lot.
Oh, of course, yeah.
That's probably a sort of pan-Florida thing. But the Timucua speaking people of northeastern Florida are the ones that get talked about the most. I'm not actually sure that I had encountered the Calusa except in like place names until doing research for this episode, actually.
I know the Calusa have gotten a lot of scholarly interest in the 20th century because they kind of defy a lot of expectations of native societies because they were very well organized with a clear class system despite not being agricultural. They were a very complex hunter-gatherer society, maybe comparable to the peoples of the Pacific Northwest. And I think this does kind of separate them from other neighboring groups who weren't necessarily simple societies, but usually had economies that you would expect to be more complex. These guys, however, despite not having any agriculture, managed to have a very successful economy largely based around maritime surplus. Archaeologists have found sophisticated nets held up by hollow gourd floats, which the Calusa used to catch huge numbers of sea creatures. And, like other peoples of the Gulf of Mexico, they piled their refuse over the centuries into giant shell mounds, which have accumulated into artificial hills that are still a notable element of the Florida landscape today. So the Spanish saw some parallels between European life and the society of the Calusa. As we mentioned, they had a sharp class distinction between commoners and aristocrats, and they also had a feudal-style tributary system across much of southern Florida. Their vassal tribes included the Miami and the Tequesta people. Confusingly, of these two, the Tequesta are the ones who actually lived in the area of Miami today. The Calusa also impressed the Spanish with their massive, well-built houses that could contain over 1,000 people, as well as their expertise in wood carvings. One famous artifact is the Key Marco cat, a humanoid panther sitting in a pose that I can only describe as serving. Seriously, Google the Key Marco cat right now. You're not going to believe this is a pre-Columbian artifact. Moving on to their religious beliefs, the Jesuit missionary Juan Rogel, who's one of our best sources on the Calusa, recorded that they believed every human had 3 souls. 2 of these souls would be reincarnated into animals of the land and sea, but the 3rd soul remained inside the body even after death. For this reason, the Calusa and their relatives, the Tequesta, would commune with grave sites to their ancestors. And the Tequesta also had an intriguing holy site known as the Miami Circle, today located just underneath the motorized drawbridge and surrounded by luxury condos. Here, 24 logs were set into the limestone, forming a space for ritual offerings of sharks, dolphins, and sea turtles. The purpose and age of the Miami Circle is still not exactly known, but it does suggest that even if South Florida might not have had a super significant population in the pre-Columbian era, it still had a lot of spiritual significance, possibly not only to the Tequesta people, but also neighboring peoples like the Calusa and the Lucayan people of the Bahamas. So Jackson, you mentioned you heard more about the Timucua people when you were growing up. What do you know about those guys? I know we discussed them briefly in our episode on New Smyrna, episode 65. Do you have anything more you could add?
So yeah, in northern Florida, there were a number of different ethnic and indigenous populations that lived in the modern day Panhandle and the Jacksonville areas. Groups like the Timucua, as we already mentioned, but also groups like the Guale, or eventually they would become the Yamasee people, and the Appalachee people lived somewhat similarly to their southern neighbors, building fairly large settlements based on aquaculture, small-scale agriculture, and hunting and gathering. The Timucua people spoken language isolate, but interestingly, Muscogean speakers like the Appalachee, the Yamasee, and eventually the Creek or the Seminoles that would enter northern Florida during Spanish dominion, they spoke languages that were derived from the languages spoken by peoples on the edges of the Mississippian mound builder cultural complex in the southern Mississippi River region. That cultural heritage of the mound building, chunky playing Mississippians is not only a sort of like interesting connection between peoples, but actually had like political economic effects down the road, even into the American period. The Native Americans that were descended from those Mississippians were sort of termed by American settlers as so-called the civilized tribes.
Yeah. And
because they had this descent from the Mississippians, who obviously commanded a large amount of agricultural surplus, they also had a lot of institutions like agricultural exploitation, also slavery, that were pretty similar to the American settlers that entered the region.
Yeah, no, another thing that it's crazy that even though Florida is usually not considered part of Mississippian civilization proper, you see these knockdown effects of Mississippian society and the fall of Mississippian society many centuries later.
Yeah, it's interesting that all of those peoples, the Muscogean speakers, to my knowledge, are not like direct descendants of the people that lived near Cahokia in modern day Illinois and Missouri, but they are sort of peoples that lived within this cultural complex that had sort of relations with those groups of people.
No, yeah, and I think it's not a terrible comparison with the ways that many peoples of the ancient Near East had, in the Mediterranean, had cultural influence from Egypt and Mesopotamia. I think that maybe if Greece is strongly influenced by the societies of Egypt, and the Near East, you could maybe have a similar parallel here with Florida and the coastal southeast and Cahokia.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, you mentioned the Seminoles. These are the most famous group, obviously, of indigenous Floridians, but we're talking about the 16th century here. They are really not part of this story yet. Again, this is a reminder that Florida has seen constant cultural changes since and after the colonial period. The Seminoles would appear deep into the colonial era, moving southward kind of as an army, kind of as a tribe, in a way vaguely reminiscent of the Goth and Vandal peoples we've discussed in our several episodes on the late Roman Empire. Just like many peoples of late antiquity, the movements of the Seminoles, and arguably their entire ethnogenesis, was a response to resistance to violent colonialism. But let's return briefly to the first explorer to land on the shores of Florida, Ponce de Leon. Because after fleeing from that first skirmish with the Calusa, in which they almost stole his ship, Ponce de Leon sailed back to Puerto Rico and from there his Spanish homeland. Back in Europe, he finally was knighted for his service around the age of 40 and was proclaimed as the governor of the new land of Florida and also of Bimini, which was believed to maybe not be the same thing. After returning to Puerto Rico, he learned that some other groups of Spaniards had tried to take Florida for themselves. So in 1521, he made the fateful decision to return to Florida and really stake his claim as governor. His second voyage was significantly larger, but also significantly shorter. His ships were filled with hundreds of settlers and livestock, including the ancestors of the many wild hogs that roam across central Florida today. Within hours of landing on the Gulf Coast and planting the Spanish flag, these settlers were attacked, however, by the Calusa. For several weeks, they attempted to build a colony around Fort Myers, but Ponce himself was then shot in the thigh by a Calusa arrow. While the wound initially did not appear too serious, it quickly began to fester, indicating poison. the entire colonial party picked up everything and fled to Cuba, leaving no archaeological trace of their failed settlement. Ponce de Leon died shortly after landing, still convinced that Florida was the mythical island of Bimini. Ponce did not have much of a legacy at the time because Florida wasn't really considered that important. But later in the 19th and 20th centuries, the myth around Ponce de Leon, and especially the Fountain of Youth, really became much more significant. These days in Miami, Ponce de Leon's name is everywhere. Additionally, the surname Ponce de Leon is not super uncommon among Cuban and Puerto Rican people, and I've met multiple people who say they are descended from Ponce de Leon. I think, maybe that's true, but also given that he might have had 20 illegitimate siblings, I feel like a lot of people might be more distant cousins of Ponce de Leon. I don't know.
I've actually also met people that claim to be descended from Ponce de Leon, so it's it's sort of a Pan-Floridian thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the...
All right, well, so,
It's the Florida equivalent of claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. All right, so Sam, when we were doing the research here, you asked what exactly went on in 300 years of colonial Spanish Florida.
Yep.
And that's kind of a difficult question to answer. Because, Florida was not really settled anywhere near the way that, let's say, the British settled Massachusetts or Virginia, or in the way that the Spanish settled Mexico and Cuba. They did not successfully impose European society onto Florida in the colonial era in any significant way. But this was not for lack of trying. Shortly after the death of Ponce de Leon, an expedition led by Panfilio de Narvaez led to stranded Spanish settlers eating each other, as we mentioned. Two of these survivors, Estevanico and Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, remarkably emerged in Spanish Mexico 8 years later, after an Odyssean journey across Texas and the American Southwest. During this time, these two men, one black and one white, were revered as holy healers by local Native Americans. Anthropologists have speculated that a dark-skinned Kachina doll of the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest may be a distant cultural memory of Estevanico, who was from West Africa.
I would absolutely watch this as a buddy comedy, for the record.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And then later in the 16th century, 1,500 Spanish settlers from Mexico attempted to settle the region of Pensacola as part of a plan to colonize the distant Carolinas before the British could get their hands on the territory. This would be just as disastrous as the Narvaez expedition, as a hurricane drowned the vast majority of these settlers before they could reach the Gulf Coast. A few dozen of the initial 1,500 managed to hang on in Florida for just a few months before returning to Mexico. Instead, the first major European colony established in Spanish Florida would not be by the Spanish at all. 50 years after Ponce de Leon, a group of 800 French people, including men, women, and children, settled around the mouth of the St. Johns River in what is today Jacksonville. These people, who we mentioned way back in episode 65, were not there on behalf of the French crown. Quite the opposite. They were Protestant refugees, Huguenots who had been refused aid by their own monarchy, as well as the British Queen Elizabeth. They initially hoped to settle Florida in secret, and that their numbers would be too great for the Spanish to dislodge. Instead, Spanish captain Pedro Menendez de Avila, probably the second most important conquistador in Florida history, led a contingent of troops to destroy the French settlement at Fort Caroline and slaughter all adult men present. I think this is a good reminder that the extreme brutality of colonial troops was sometimes even inflicted upon fellow Europeans, especially as the Catholic Spaniards saw these Huguenots as vile heretics. Pedro Menendez then established his own settlement close to the ruins of the French colony he destroyed. This would be St. Augustine, the oldest surviving European settlement in the 50 states. Menendez was subsequently appointed governor of both Florida and Cuba. He was involved in another ill-fated attempt to claim the Carolinas for Spain. He made contact with the Tequesta people of Southeast Florida and was probably the first European to set foot in modern-day Miami. He then sailed around the tip to meet the proud Calusa people on the Gulf Coast, surely knowing they had killed his forebear Ponce de Leon a generation before. Like many of these explorers, Pedro Menendez married a native woman, a Calusa noblewoman known only by her Christian name, Lady Antonia. The Calusa-style wedding seems to have a lot in common with the European royal nuptials, as it featured a choir of young girl singers and had at least one dancing dwarf. Menendez hoped that by joining his bloodline to that of the Calusa king Carlos, he would pave his way toward the conversion of the Calusa, and from there all the Florida Indians. This king, who was most likely the grandson of the previous Carlos who met Ponce de Leon, told Pedro Menendez he was interested in his new religion, but this might have just been some diplomatic sweet talk to convince these powerful foreigners to ally with him rather than his cousin Felipe or the rival Tocobega people to the north. After this wedding, in which Lady Antonia impressed the Spanish with her delicate courtly manners, Carlos had her and some ladies-in-waiting sent to Cuba to be taught Spanish customs and the Catholic religion. But during this time, most of Antonia's companions all died of European diseases, leaving her depressed and friendless in a foreign land. While in Cuba, I would expect she also witnessed the ongoing enslavement and extreme violence meted against indigenous peoples like herself. Pedro Menendez was also apparently not particularly interested in his new wife. According to Father Rogel, Antonia was upset that the two of them had not yet had any children, and she was also mad that these bloodthirsty Spaniards, famous for their violence, would not wipe out the Tocobega people to the north, who Antonia saw as her fiercest enemies. After Menendez organized a peace treaty between the Calusa and the Tocobega, Antonia furiously separated from her husband, returning to her brother Carlos, who might have also been her ex-husband. Eventually, as relations worsened, the Tocobega would withdraw from Calusa territory altogether. Antonia, a stranger between these two worlds now, decided to return to Cuba without her estranged husband, and there she would die of disease, just like her companions before her. Menendez himself would too die of disease while on a return trip to Spain. Although he was completely unsuccessful at settling the Florida Peninsula, he and his men did take major steps toward the Christianization of the Indians. According to the historian Alan Taylor, Spanish authorities recognized that Florida was so remote, so hot, and so mosquito-ridden that attracting Spanish settlers would be nearly impossible. Instead, they would make Spanish subjects out of the native population, just as Menendez had done with his spouse, Lady Antonia. After Menendez died, the missionary efforts were continued by Franciscan and Jesuit monks, who established competing chains of missions like the much more famous ones in Spanish California, except these Florida missions were 200 years earlier.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting, and I think also important to note that these missions would basically form the bedrock of Spanish Floridian society until the British took over the territory in the 18th century. Like, unlike other places like in Mexico, where there were missions, but there were also like other attempts to sort of set up economic enterprises. The missions and mission extraction was really the heart of Spanish Florida.
Yeah, there's a popular narrative we should mention, especially popular in certain online Catholic circles, that conquistadors were brutal marauders, but the missionaries, however, they were benign saintly protectors. This is to say, defenders of Spanish colonialism will admit that early explorers robbed Indians of treasure, food, and dignity, even demanding access to their bodies through forced labor and sexual abuse. But the missions sought to cultivate these rustic pagans into proper Christian, protecting their wards from violent attacks by Europeans, saving their souls by showing them the path to eternal paradise. In some places, there certainly were conflicts between religious and military authorities over how to treat the locals. Sometimes these conflicts involved missionaries intervening to protect people. We see this especially in Paraguay. But in practice, both of these two groups of Spaniards used violent means of coercion or abuse to subjugate native peoples. Both of them forced indigenous peoples to perform unpaid labor in their haciendas, and both were advancing an agenda of cultural genocide over indigenous peoples. The Spanish might have seen the missionary and military approaches to colonization as the carrot and the stick. I think it's really more like the rod or the sword. Either way, you're going to bleed. The clergy might have rarely killed Native Americans outright, unlike their secular counterparts, but we can't give these frontier friars too much credit. They were destroying sacred sites and idols to eradicate ancestral belief systems, and they typically beat or flogged any suspected pagan backsliders. In the 1950s, some boaters on Hontoon Island, 40 minutes north of Orlando, found a strange, tall idol in the silt of the St. Johns River. It was a pine log, carved into the shape of an owl with huge, luminous eyes, remarkably similar in style to the totem poles of the Pacific Northwest. This statue was attributed to the obscure Mayaca people, who disappeared from all records in the 18th century, like many other Florida natives. And it is without parallel in Florida archaeology. This may very well have been the kind of sacred objects that were hunted down and destroyed by the missionaries. It reminds us how much we will never know about life in indigenous Florida because of this process of cultural destruction.
Like we said, the mission system and this system of mission extraction of Native American produce was sort of the story of the first Spanish period, and it carried on that way for most of its time length. It also included sort of lightly populated Spanish fortifications along strategic choke points. So like we said, St. Augustine was the first European settlement to sort of be permanently established in the United States. But it was not a major metropolis by any means. It was populated specifically to garrison troops to basically observe pirates and enemy ships that were sailing in the New World, and its population was only sparsely bolstered by European settlers. In many ways, the Spanish presence in Florida is unlike many of their other American conquests. They didn't really co-opt native kingdoms into a Roman-style client relationship to the same extent that they did in Mesoamerica or Peru, nor did they wipe out 95+% of the natives and replace them with African slave labor to farm cash crops like they did in the Caribbean. Indeed, Spanish Florida most resembles, actually, I think, the Philippines, because it was a lightly held and far-off possession of the Spanish crown, which was garrisoned with just enough European soldiers to hold on to it, and whose native population and their already extant power structures were, instead of being like completely subjugated to the Spanish or sort of essentially vassals of the Spanish, they were mostly in a sort of clientelist alliance with the Spanish rather than being outright dominated by them.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it makes a sort of interesting sort of full circle, because now a lot of northern Florida has a pretty significant Filipino population as well. So it is sort of these things sort of rhyme throughout history.
Yeah.
I think it's worth just reiterating again at this point that the Spanish really did not settle Florida. They were almost entirely uninterested with moving Europeans into the interior of the peninsula, and what development did take place was sporadic and often sort of under their noses or not really with their say-so. However, this also kind of gave St. Augustine like a really interesting Borderlands character. The city was like remarkably diverse for most of the Spanish period. Actually, Native Americans settled in and around the city, and their populations would sort of swell up in times of conflict, where it was it became essentially a refugee camp. And diverse Europeans also sort of came into the city and lived there as well. Most of the early merchants in the town were not actually Spanish, but instead were Portuguese, and most of those merchants were probably conversos, meaning that they were probably sort of on paper only Catholics that had recently converted, or whose family had recently converted from Sephardic Judaism. And that sort of situation where there were tons of different peoples living in St. Augustine would continue through the colonial period, even when the British took over in the late 18th century, when Catalan and Greek workers from New Smyrna, who Gladio heads will certainly remember.
Yes.
Those guys actually moved to St. Augustine after New Smyrna failed, and they made up almost a quarter of the city's population in the late 18th century. There was actually a like Catalan quarter of St. Augustine that is you don't really hear about it as much nowadays in the sort of touristy sort of story of the city, but it was certainly there.
Yeah, and I think it's also kind of interesting, even though the rest of Florida colonization was very different from the rest of Spanish America, St. Augustine does seem not entirely different from somewhere like Havana or even Mexico City, in that you have a significant Native American population, including many people acculturated into Spanish culture. You also have significant numbers of conversos. And then you have all of these Catholic Spaniards who are not actually coming from Castile, but coming from the more economically depressed borderlands, the peripheries, like, the Canary Islands, Galicia, Catalonia.
Yeah, and in the same way that the conquest of Mexico is sort of those conquistadors that made up that party, a lot of them were actually sort of second generation Spanish Canarians.
Yeah.
There's no reason to assume that the sort of early conquistadors in Florida that sailed with Ponce de Leon were not of similar makeup.
No, totally. And that's, we mentioned this, how there's this interesting link between the Reconquista and later colonization. And, I think, you could argue that the Canary Islands, which they were not Muslim, but they were understood as this process of Spanish expansion during the Reconquista, they really were ground zero. They were the landing point. They were the venture point for American colonization. We're going to see something very similar a couple centuries later with our friend Andrew Jackson, who is descended from the Ulster Scots, those being British settlers in Northern Ireland. Again, kind of a dress rehearsal for colonization. But we are getting way ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to colonial St. Augustine. Tell us a little bit more about the 18th century Florida and how it went from being Spanish to briefly being British.
Yeah, so it's important to remember at this point that colonial Spanish, the first Spanish period of Florida colonization lasted longer than the United States has been around. It was
crazy.
It is genuinely mind-boggling to think about, especially because they really didn't do a lot with it during that time. The territory basically carried on in the manner that we just described for that time period. The peoples that lived in northern Florida, they started to decline, as Native American peoples did all over the American continents, as a result of disease, but also as a result of conflict with neighboring Creek peoples that, as the British started to settle the Carolinas and Georgia, allied with them and were basically induced to attack the Spanish in northern Florida. Mm-hmm. Those same Creek peoples, they were sort of allies of convenience with the British, and the Spanish kind of sought to win them over occasionally. Yeah. And one of the ways that they sought to do that was by opening immigration from Creek lands in sort of the riverine areas of Mississippi and Alabama. They opened up immigration from those Creek peoples into the Panhandle and into the interior of Florida in the 18th century. Yeah, and so by the mid-18th century, after the 7 Years' War, obviously also known as the French and Indian War in the Americas, the Spanish territory of Florida passed from Spanish hands into British hands. So the British took over Cuba. They captured Havana in the 7 Years' War. And essentially, to give it back to the Spanish, they didn't really want to keep it because it would be really hard to hold. But they wanted something in return, and what they got in return was Florida.
No, it's amazing. Only a historical accident saved us from having Gringo Havana.
Right. And so as the British took over Spanish Florida, the British split the territory into two. Yeah. The modern-day Panhandle was merged with the newly acquired French territories in Alabama and Mississippi to become West Florida, and that was sort of centered on that fort town of Pensacola, which is it is still a big town today. It's still a significant area in Florida, but it used to be the main area of Florida, and in the next episode we'll kind of see why that is no longer true. But the rest of the territory became East Florida, and that was based on the old capital of St. Augustine. Yeah. Two things to say about that I think are sort of interesting and important to keep in mind is that, one, by this point the Spanish had built the sort of famous castle that is in St. Augustine, even to this day, called the Castillo de San Marcos.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yes, I have been there probably a dozen times. And it is sort of significant because it doesn't get torn down by subsequent peoples who take over Florida, right? The British garrison it, and they use it basically for the same purpose that the Spanish had. And then when the Spanish come back, they will garrison it again, and then the Americans will garrison it when they take over the territory as well. So it's interesting to just think about this sort of imposing castle that's sort of almost out of place in the New World that is being traded over by these two groups. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the Spanish did not stick around when the British took over. Yeah. In a kind of like ominous portent of like future conflicts in Europe, the Spanish population of St. Augustine was basically induced to be transferred over to Cuba. They were technically given the choice, but it was sort of one of those things where it was like, well, nobody can really guarantee your safety if you stay here. And only 3 of the 500 Spanish families that lived in St. Augustine stayed in St. Augustine after the British took over. Those families that went to Cuba, many of them returned once the Spanish returned about 20 years later after the American Revolution. But it really kind of served as a kind of grim portent of future removals and ethnic conflict that would come in the peninsula in the 19th century.
Yes. And especially because these deportations, or inducements, you could say, they weren't only for white Spaniards. They applied just as much to Native Americans. And so Calusa and Tequesta society essentially vanish overnight in Florida. We're going to see there is a really interesting lingering presence of Calusa descendants, but this is the great rupture between, the period of King Carlos and into the period of, the 19th century when the Seminoles get there. It's because of this deportation to Cuba. Once these Native American peoples arrived in Cuba, they basically almost completely disappear from the historical record. Most indigenous native languages of Florida go extinct in this process. It's very possible that these Native Americans were treated quite terribly in colonial Cuba. They were certainly marginalized. They may have been exposed to new diseases. Either way, I think this deportation was a really bad deal for indigenous Floridians. We also should mention deportation applied to the third big group of Florida society we haven't really discussed yet. Those are the Maroons, one of, I think, the most interesting and under-discussed aspects of colonial American history. Jackson, what can you say about your familiarity with Maroon communities in Florida?
Yeah, so we'll talk about this a little bit later, but part of the new sort of public history initiatives that have been happening in the area that I grew up in, obviously Jacksonville near St. Augustine, is this growing understanding of Black Floridians as a super significant part of the Spanish colonial process, right? So we'll get into it a little bit more later, but there was a fort near Jacksonville, actually it was closer to St. Augustine, but it was called Fort Mose, where essentially the Spanish used runaway slaves from the plantations in Georgia and the Carolinas as their sort of first line of defense. So this has sort of been a more prominent part of history education as the 2000s have gone on.
Definitely. And so the word maroon, which most likely comes from a Native American Taino word, it refers to communities of free Black people who are almost always descended from escaped slaves that usually operated on the fringes of colonial society. They're mostly associated with the Caribbean, especially the Spanish Caribbean, but there were Maroon communities in, the modern day United States as well. And you could argue that there are Maroon communities to this day. The Garifuna people of Central America are a good example. They actually speak an indigenous language picked up by their Arawakan neighbors. And then the nation of Guyana has multiple surviving Maroon communities that speak different languages that are totally unintelligible with each other, but are both a mix of English and various African languages. As early as the late 16th century, free Black people escaping the Bahamas and Cuba, which were Spanish at the time, as well as later English colonies like the Carolinas, began to emerge in Spanish Florida. Like we said, the word maroon comes from the Taino word cimarron, which means escaped livestock. This clearly shows the, condescending way the Spanish saw these people. That being said, the Maroons certainly lived much better and freer lives than Black people really anywhere else in the Americas at this time. They made contacts with both colonial groups as well as local indigenous peoples. They occasionally allied themselves with European bandits and pirates, like most famously Sir Francis Drake. There were small Maroon communities across the modern-day United States, in Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, of course, and the Great Dismal Swamp region of the Carolinas. But really, I think it's in Florida where there's the most extensive history of Maroon communities. You mentioned there was that Fort Mose, established in the 18th century to house free Black people who had been living in Florida since the 16th century. The fort took its name from a local creek, which had a Timucua name, but I gotta wonder if the people living there noticed the similarity to Moses, who of course is a very important anti-slavery symbol across, American history. Most of the few dozen residents of Fort Mose had been born in Africa, but over time, some of them would be completely autochthonous peoples, of American origin, raised in a mix of Spanish and basically African American culture. Shortly after the fort was founded in the 1740s, men from Fort Mose successfully repelled a British filibuster from South Carolina. And it's very possible that some of the white men leading this attack could have been the former slave owners of the fort's defenders. A big open question is what happened to these free black people of Florida after 1763 when the colony passed into British hands. Like Jackson said, the Spanish evacuated most of their subjects from the peninsula. This included white Spaniards, it included the Calusa and Tequesta. It certainly included many free black people, but we don't know if it included all free black people. We know for a fact that in British Florida, there were large numbers of free black people living outside of colonial control. I think it is very possible that these people may have been descendants from these earlier Maroon communities like the people of Fort Mose. If this is the case, it means that some Black Americans in Florida today might actually have the longest continuous history of habitation, longer than not only white settlers, but longer even than the native Seminole, who wouldn't get down to Florida until the British period for the most part. But Seminoles are still a little bit away. So during the brief British occupation of Florida, which lasted from the 7 Years' War to the American Revolutions, new, harsher restrictions on the rights of free black people were imposed. But these restrictions weren't necessarily really put into practice. The population of enslaved black people steadily rose as white settlers from the Carolinas and the British Caribbean brought their slaves into the new British Florida territories. They began establishing a plantation economy that would, in a sense, remain in place until the Civil War. Additionally, neighboring Native American nations would also adopt plantation economies, including racial chattel slavery. During this 20-year British period, the main change was the establishment of Pensacola that we mentioned, and of course, New Smyrna, the disastrous folly of a classical-obsessed British merchant who tried to set up a utopian colony of Greek and Spanish settlers. The Spanish, however, regained control in 1783 as part of the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution. But at this point, they had to contend with a population that was now a lot more British than Spanish. White settlers who now found themselves Spanish subjects were outnumbered 2-to-1 by their slaves. And that's not taking into account Native Americans and free black people living within and outside colonial society. When Spanish law was reapplied, the black population, both slave and free, found themselves to be relatively safer and better protected overnight in comparison to their relatives who remained in the British colonies. Just like we saw in Louisiana, which was actually also Spanish during this period, significant numbers of free black people would become slave owners themselves. One of the wealthiest known landowners in West Florida during the Second Spanish period was Jean-Baptiste Bienville, who confusingly has the exact same name as the French governor of Louisiana, who might have been this guy's namesake. But this guy, Jean-Baptiste, was Afro-Floridian. He was born into slavery, yet owned a large and successful plantation with at least 20 slaves. He himself was not literate, as he had been denied a formal education, yet was successful enough to manage his plantation and was respected enough to oversee legal contracts. Emancipation was significantly more common in Spanish Florida than it was in British or French colonies. This was largely because the Spanish legal system, as late as the 19th century, was still based on medieval Castilian legal codes. These Spanish laws were derived from earlier ancient Roman law, which greatly predate the practice of racial chattel slavery or even the development of racial hierarchies at all. This means that ancient Roman ideas about slavery and personhood were applied to Spanish America, where in British America, slaves were legally categorized only as property. As a consequence, manumission was significantly more common in Spanish territories, and freedmen and their free descendants were a major chunk of the population of colonial Florida. Free black people continued to live both within and without colonial society. They were a huge and, as Jackson said, often overlooked aspect of 18th and 19th century Florida society.
Yeah, and because Florida was such a crude frontier, the necessities of life would force the whites to abandon many racial hangups that they had elsewhere. Florida had practically no civil institutions, so individual landowners often had to serve as merchants, judges, and amateur lawyers rolled into one. Because there were practically no towns, life was centered around these individual plantations. And so Jean-Baptiste Bienville was a major figure in his corner of the West Florida wilderness, and both black and white settlers of poorer rank came to him for assistance. At one point, a penniless white woman asked to spend the rest of her days on the plantation after she lost her home. But we should remember that despite the relative equality enjoyed by free black people in Spanish Florida, this was in every sense a white supremacist society. The same casta system that existed in Mexico and Cuba applied to Florida. Incoming white residents, including illegal American settlers, were immediately on a social rung above the longtime free black or mixed race residents. Additionally, after the Haitian Revolution, when huge numbers of slave owners and their slaves fled to Spanish New Orleans, nearby Spanish West Florida prohibited any free black Haitians from immigrating to the colony, out of fear that they would stir up revolutionary sentiment among the slaves. We should mention that the black population of Florida at this time was huge. The combined number of free black people and slaves greatly outnumbered white settlers. Many black people also lived among the neighboring indigenous peoples like the Creeks and the Seminoles, both as slaves as well as free tribal members, as we'll see. East Florida also had really remarkable populations of free black people who were living in the wilderness outside of European and Indian influence.
Yeah, because, Fort Mose, it's kind of going to come back.
Yeah, and I think that it's sort of, we've talked about the sort of legal reasoning for Spanish. Toleration's maybe a little bit too generous of a term, but sort of relative toleration from the Spanish towards black people in East Florida was really also for practical reasons as well. Because Florida's main sort of reason for being was that it was a outpost through which the Spanish could project power against their enemies. And their main enemies in this region at the time were the British. Those black people that lived in Florida were solidly anti-British. I mean, a lot of them literally had escaped from British plantations in Carolina and Georgia. And those free black populations could be counted on to defend the colony against incursions from the Carolinas and then, again, Georgia. The Spanish didn't just kind of tolerate them, they also sort of cultivated those communities as well, right? So we talked about Fort Mose. We've talked about that a lot. The fort was sort of entrusted with the defense of St. Augustine, right? They were sort of put on the front lines, so to speak. They were sort of entrusted with the defense of Spanish Florida. Barrier to entry in Spanish society for black Floridians was not really that high, like we've talked about. Like, it was essentially just converting to Catholicism, which for many escaped slaves was not really too much of an ask. This legacy of sort of complicated and complex sort of racial, social institutions sort of continued throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries as well, right? So Florida under Jim Crow also sort of became a haven for African-American refugees. Some freedmen established small sugar farms south of Lake Okeechobee and in the Everglades, and may have actually been the first non-indigenous people to live in the South Florida wetlands. Indeed, we will probably talk about this in the next or maybe the third episode, but Florida almost occupied a place in the minds of black Americans in the 19th and 20th centuries that's honestly not that dissimilar from the place that the Western frontier sort of had in the minds of white Americans. It was sort of seen as like this place where they could start over, where it was so remote that they would be able to be away from the racial prejudice of broader American society, but it was sort of close enough to be able to be moved to from these, at the time, still largely Southern communities. It was this sort of this place where they could envision building a sort of better society. Shout out to one-time Jacksonville resident Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. A large part of that book deals with one such community.
And there's one last interesting cultural element of the history of Black Americans in Florida, and that is, of course, Caribbean immigrants. Because not all Black Floridians in the 18th and 19th century were either freedmen's, slaves, or Maroons, as some of them actually were foreign sailors, mostly from the Bahamas, who had been visiting the Florida Keys since the 18th century, often to trade with indigenous peoples like eventually the Seminole. By the statehood period, Bahamian workers were regularly employed in construction projects and public works projects, not just in Florida, but all across the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, especially the Panama Canal in the 19th century. Coconut Grove, the oldest part of what is today Miami, was founded by a mix of Black Bahamian workers and white New England sailors in the 1840s. These Bahamians would later become the bulk of the labor force on Henry Flagler's railroad, which was fundamental to the establishment of the city of Miami. As late as the 1920s, when the Miami population really began to explode, we'll talk about this in the later episodes, Bahamians were still a major element of the South Florida landscape and were probably a majority of the Black population. To this day, there are some surviving houses in Coconut Grove built in Bahamian style, and Bahamian conch fritters are a fundamental South Florida regional food. There is one last Maroon we should mention, who is Black Caesar, the pirate king of the Florida Keys, known entirely from one source, the General History of the Pirates, published in London by an unknown British author in 1724. There's no way to know what elements of the story is true, and it's very possible that Black Caesar and other figures in this book were entirely fictitious. But as the story goes, Black Caesar was once a slave held aboard a ship that crashed into the perilous Keys, allowing him to escape in the early 18th century, but remain in the area as a plunderer of passing ships. He supposedly commandeered one of these ships, but modified it so it had removable masts. With his vessel hidden by the thick mangroves, he could sail out without being noticed. But by the time he got his masts back up and the sails unfurled, it would be too late for his prey to get away. Black Caesar was said to capture whites and force them into being his own personal slaves, holding them hostage on remote desert islands before they could be ransomed. This was possibly the greatest anxiety of white Englishmen in the 18th century. Even though Black Caesar might have never existed, his story contributed to the image of Florida as dangerous and uncivilized, a place where all the rules of proper European society were turned on their head. To a small extent, this narrative was true, because white people living in Florida in the 18th century had to coexist with many others. In many cases, these white settlers would in fact willingly become members of non-European societies, particularly the Creeks and the Seminole.
Yeah, so at this point, we're at the beginning of the 19th century. The population of Florida is still overwhelmingly indigenous. And the Native Americans of Florida, as well as neighboring Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, as well as Louisiana, have formed well-organized governments that had some degree of international recognition between the various colonial powers of southeastern North America, including the now recently nascent United States. We described previously how the Native Americans of the 16th century, those living in the time of Pedro Menendez and Ponce de Leon, were basically discontinuous with native Floridians several centuries later, due to mass mortality caused by a combination of European diseases and genocidal European violence. Newer peoples came into the region and became indigenous in relation to their colonizers, despite ironically having less of a history in the area than the Spanish or the French. During this migration, which has some very rough parallels with movements of peoples and movements of identity towards the end of the Roman Empire, newer groups expanded across pre-existing groups while also adopting many colonial European customs, as well as often adopting individual Europeans themselves.
Right, so the Muscogee people, who are generally known as the Creek in English, were the most significant Native American group in the Deep South in the 18th and 19th centuries. They were, as we said earlier, descendants to some extent of the great Mississippian peoples who lived contemporaneous with the European Middle Ages. The Muscogee, as a member of the so-called Five Civilized Tribes, settled mostly in North Florida and Georgia. To their north were the Cherokee, their sometimes rivals who spoke an unrelated language of the Iroquoian family but had a sort of parallel relationship to Mississippian civilization and American colonialism. The Creek were also closely related to the Choctaw and Chickasaw peoples to their west, and they were very intimately connected with the emergence of the Seminole people, who we're going to get to in a second. All of these 5 groups and several others migrated southwards after the initial period of Spanish contact. Violence and disease brought by the conquistadors totally destabilized pre-existing societies in the lower Mississippian Valley and the Gulf of Mexico. The ensuing period, which is extremely poorly documented, saw Muscogean clans move southward toward the coast, filling the power vacuum left by the remnants of Mississippian culture and absorbing other nations. For instance, the Yuchi people, who are today legally members of the Muscogee Creek Nation, speak a language isolate that predates the spread of Muscogean. As Creek peoples moved southwards, it's very possible they absorbed some members of the Timucua people encountered by the earliest conquistadors, as well as some of the Black Maroons still living in territories claimed by Spain. The Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw are all described as tribes or ethnic groups in contemporary language, but in the 18th and 19th centuries, these 3 groups were really loose political associations of autonomous villages speaking related languages. These villages, called talwas in Muscogean, or tribal towns in English, were a little bit like the Greek polis. They were independent units with a shared identity and some kind of republican internal structure. Towns were pledged to defend each other against common threats, but they maintained their own civic identities across time and even space. A tribal town was understood to still exist, even if it had been dismantled, and all of its citizens were moving elsewhere. And this happened often in a world constantly churning from various kinds of turmoil and violence. Creek tribal towns were all apparently split between white towns, whose residents favored reconciliation with colonists, and the red towns that were more resistant and sometimes violent. These factions, which were surely oversimplified by European writers, existed to some extent among the Chickasaw and the Choctaw confederacies as well. According to the historian Brian Rindfleisch, white towns were associated with the greater influence of older men, particularly civic leaders called mikos, and red towns were associated with greater influence of young men seeking to prove themselves in warfare. Political divide had a spiritual element, as it was believed to be a duty of the Mikos, as well as all women, to whiten the red hearts of youthful warriors. You know, Sam, when we were prepping this one, you brought up the comparison with the, hypothesized Kuros people of the ancient Indo-European steppe. Remember that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that is kind of an interesting parallel here, because both these Proto-Indo-European warbands and these later 18th and 19th century Creek and other Muscogean groups, you do have this clear cultural awareness of young male restlessness and the belief that if this restlessness is not properly checked or directed outside the community, it would invariably be let loose within the community. Red and white towns would have a tense and competitive relationship within the Creek Nation of Georgia and northern Florida. European merchants would often be dismayed to learn that trading rights had passed from friendly white towns to angrier red towns. Sometimes these political conflicts spilled over into violence, but it was usually mediated through sports. Red and white townsfolk met on paved ball courts for the chunky game, where players would try to throw spears through rolling stone circles. And within and across the towns, Creek people were organized into various matrilineal clans. Despite men dominating most leadership positions, legitimacy was claimed through the mother's ancestry. And this was also a polygamous society, so many Creek fathers had to split their time between multiple wives and many children. Europeans noted this meant that Creek children had a much closer relationship with their mothers than their fathers, and I wonder if this polygamous society is the root of this matrilineal clan structure. We even have very limited evidence of Creek family court. Whenever a divorce occurred, the wife was automatically granted custody of the children and possession of the husband's home. The husband relinquished any and all paternal rights. So I gotta say, I am very, very glad that 18th century Creek men did not have access to Twitter.
Yeah.
So, of all of these various matrilineal clans, one of them really stands out, and that is the Wind Clan, whose members were particularly influential across the Muscogee Confederation, giving us many leaders who rose to prominence in both Florida and Georgia. Creek leaders like an obscure chief with the great name Emperor Brim took advantage of the complex political structure of the colonial Southeast by allying with the British, sometimes the French, other times the Spanish, and playing these various forces against each other, as well as against the powerful Cherokee to the north. Through this careful manipulation of alliances, the Creek, better known as more formally the Muscogean Confederacy, asserted themselves as the most significant power in the Southeast, more powerful not only than other Native Americans, but more powerful than any given colonial entity at the end of the 18th century. The reason why the Creek were considered civilized by whites was that they adopted many aspects of European society, including Old World forms of agriculture, heavier clothing, English-style construction techniques, and slavery. This is sometimes considered a tricky or uncomfortable subject. I think there's some fear among scholars that too much discussion of Native Americans as slave owners somehow justifies their oppression and expulsion by the American state. But I think that's absurd because, not only should no slave owner be let off the hook, we also have to keep in mind that, first, the same white Americans who expelled these people were obviously themselves slave owners. Additionally, they were ultimately the source of racial chattel slavery within Native American societies. Because as we mentioned, significant numbers of white Americans settled within the Creek Nation, often becoming adopted into the Creek tribe. Most of these men were slave owners who brought black slaves with them into Creek territory. Although some whites disapproved of any indigenous adoption of European culture and technology, others, like the U.S. Indian agent Benjamin Hawkins, specifically instructed Creek leaders in plantation agriculture. Benjamin Hawkins introduced not only slavery, but also ideological racial white supremacy to the Creek people. Discrimination, therefore, against the descendants of slaves and freedmen within Creek society became a major problem and continues to some extent to this day. Among the Creeks and the Seminoles, there were ongoing disputes about whether or not black people within those tribes count as tribal members, even if culturally they are, for all intents and purposes, completely Native American. But you know what? Now let's talk about the Seminoles, because like you said, Jackson, they are probably the most famous of all the Florida natives, maybe second only to the Calusa. They are, of course, they have a long history in American sports. They are very prominent among American casinos. They are today the owners of the Hard Rock Casino. They really have one of the most interesting indigenous histories of any native group in the U.S. What are your thoughts on, the legacy of the Seminoles broadly?
Well, obviously, as someone who knows and is related to many Florida State graduates, the the imagery of the Seminoles sort of looms pretty large over Florida. But I also think that maybe it's sort of because of the, as we'll get into, sort of similarities in the identity construction of the Seminole people in Florida to later attempts at identity construction amongst Floridians, like white Floridians, in the 19th and 20th century. I think that this sort of they're sort of intriguing to a lot of people because of, not just because of their sort of dogged and fierce resistance to the American state in the 19th century, but also because there is sort of this. They're sort of a melting pot of their own that I think a lot of Floridians sort of see, and they're like, yeah, that's kind of what we still are in a way.
Yeah, I know. I think that's true. Anyway, this is true to an extent for all Muscogean peoples. But what's interesting is that the Seminole began as a political formation that then shifted to becoming basically an ethnic group. They were first recorded as a group within the Creek, led by an ambitious chief known as Ahia the Cowkeeper. Right from the start, the Seminole were recorded as being particularly mobile and particularly adaptable to different natural and cultural environments. And I think both of the two proposed etymologies of the name Seminole attest to this. The word could either come from the Spanish cimarron, which is the source of maroon, or it could be from a Muscogean word for hunter-gatherers, which was meant to contrast the Seminole with the vast majority of Creek people who led a more sedentary existence. Ahia the cowkeeper was first recorded as an ally of English settlers in Georgia in the 1740s, taking part in one of several failed attacks on the Spanish town of St. Augustine. Ahia, possibly with other Seminole leaders, then led his people deeper into the Florida peninsula, passing through the Creek lower towns of North Florida to establish the Seminole as the primary demographic force in the whole peninsula, outnumbering the Spanish and the other indigenous peoples and free black people, all of whom they eagerly harassed through constant attacks and raids. As you can guess by Ahia's nickname, Cowkeeper, the Seminole were largely pastoral, they were semi-nomadic, they commanded large herds of cattle all across Florida, and conducted daunting cattle raids against their rivals, just like peoples of early modern Scotland or the ancient Eurasian steppe. They were skilled with European guns, and they transformed colonial fashion into proud national costume. To this day, Seminole and Muscogean women wear Victorian-style dresses in bright patchwork colors. Men wear iconic striped shirts and jackets. In this color palette and style, I think Seminole clothing is actually remarkably similar to the traditional clothing of indigenous women in Mexico and Central America, and is a reminder of, the shared Spanish heritage here. But so despite the significant influence of the Seminole and the cultural accommodation you saw between the Seminoles and some white settlers, obviously today the Seminole are not the primary cultural influence in Florida. Modern Florida is shaped profoundly by the United States and is, of course, today an extension of white settler society. This is in spite of the remarkable endurance of the Seminoles and the related Miccosukee people, as well as the continuing resilience of Latin American and Caribbean culture, especially in South Florida. But what I think is especially unusual is that this Anglo-American identity really took root in Florida before the territory was part of the United States. Because under both the first and second periods of Spanish rule, settlers from the American South began to reside in East and West Florida, mostly entering illegally. While no demographic data exists, it seems that by the second half of the 18th century, especially after the brief period of British rule, there were way more English speakers in Spanish Florida than Spanish speakers. Geographic proximity meant it was much easier for people to enter Florida from Britain's populous 13 colonies than it was from Spanish Cuba or Mexico. And also remember, the parts of Florida closest to Cuba were very, very hard to live in until the 20th century. Just to illustrate this point, today, Miami-Dade County is the most populous part of Florida. It's got 3 million people. But when it was incorporated in 1840, Miami-Dade County had 400 people. After the Florida Keys were separated from Miami-Dade and carved out into Monroe County, Dade County shrank to 83 people. And this is in an area about twice the size of Rhode Island.
That's
so
crazy.
Again, just keep in mind here, all of these populations we're describing are very low in number, especially in southern Florida. But moving back to this, illegal gringo settlement of Spanish America, this is something you saw all across the Spanish frontier. You saw it in Texas most famously. What's unusual about Anglos in Florida is that they were pretty much indifferent to who was ruling them. They were neither supporters of American rule like the Anglos of Texas, and they were not also staunch loyalists, as we saw with Anglo settlers in Spanish Louisiana. Instead, the Anglos of Florida were very happy to have essentially no government at all. They recognized that the Spanish, as a weaker and more remote power, were less likely to interfere with their lives than either the British or the Americans. So these Florida settlers, the so-called Florida crackers, were really not opposed to Spanish rule and were remarkably politically flexible. They were content to live under any local authority, even for many of them, local Native American authorities. They simply wanted to keep their frontier farms, which were almost entirely powered by slavery, intact and untaxed. These few thousand Florida cracker settlers lived a mean and meager existence. I should mention that cracker there is actually the technical term for Florida residents. Have you ever met anyone, Jackson, who proclaims to be a Florida cracker today?
I'm not sure that I've ever met anyone that proclaimed it, but it is sort of I think it's something that early sort of like teens Floridians are kind of told like, hey, like, like that word for white people that you can use. It's like, it actually comes from us. So it is sort of like it's sort of a sort of interesting tidbit that I think you pick up growing up there.
Yeah. The population of the Florida crackers really began to grow after the American Revolution because a lot of loyalists fled the 13 colonies into Florida, escaping reprisals, basically. But that being said, even though these people might have been loyalists, once they got to Florida, which at this time was Spanish, they didn't really have, much pro-British sentiment going on. Initially, all of these English-speaking settlers were coming in illegally, but the Spanish realized once they retook Florida after 20 years of British rule, they basically wanted all the settlers they could have, even if these people were not Spaniards. So in 1787, they gave legal status to all Americans or Brits in Florida and allowed basically any number of Anglo settlers to enter Florida. They were supposed to speak Spanish and practice Catholicism, but just as we saw with Texas, this was not actually enforced in practice. Early Florida thus became an unusual place of ethnic mixing, taking cues more from French Louisiana and Latin America than from British colonies. Intermarriage between free black people and Native Americans was exceptionally widespread, but so too was intermingling of all kinds between Native Americans and whites. Many settlers were single men who married Creek or Seminole women, often adopting elements of their in-laws' culture. The Spanish had to make it a crime for white men to be dressed or painted like Indians, because so many settlers essentially became members of the Muscogee and Seminole nations. There was also, of course, a lot of cultural accommodation with the pre-existing Spanish and French cultures of the Southeast. Some of these people nominally converted from Protestantism to Catholicism, and they often Hispanicized their names. Records include landowners named Santiago Fuller, Maria O'Brien, and Alejandro O'Reilly, the last of whom was governor of Spanish Louisiana and one of many Irish immigrants who served for Spain or the Spanish-American republics, as we discussed in episode 92 on the Irish in Latin America. Also, some of these early Florida crackers were not actually American. They were born abroad, particularly in Scotland. Scotland produced a whole class of ambitious young merchants and adventurers who were often more interested in joining indigenous societies than destroying them. The major economy in Western Florida in the 18th and early 19th centuries was the so-called Indian trade, where merchants, mostly of Scottish descent, would sail upriver to the Creek and other Muscogean settlements to trade manufactured Western goods for pelts and other Native American manufacturers. It really needs to be reiterated. This was the economy of the inland Deep South in the 1820s, when the cotton and Indian removal made agriculture dominant. This was big business, and Pensacola, which was the most prominent and important city in Florida up until the Civil War, was built on top of this trade. Jackson, you did a lot of the research here. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that the merchant penetration of the inland Deep South was something that, like we said, didn't really end until the 1820s when that land was sort of made available for white settlement by Indian removal and the cotton boom, right? So the sort of it's hard to think about now because it is, the population numbers are so small, and it would be like, well, how would you establish an economy based on this? But in a lot of ways, like the sort of riverine Deep South, up until, like we said, the 1820s, was mostly based on trading with Native Americans and sort of circulating those goods in and around the other parts of like Anglo-America or even into Europe, right? This is obviously the time of the sort of the beaver pelt hat and things like that. So this was like really big business, and a lot of people made a lot of money off of this.
No, totally. And, this Caledonian connection, shall we say, really went straight to the top, because not only were a lot of these lower level traders of Scottish descent, but many elite Scotsmen had connections to British military officers operating in the two Florida colonies. And for this reason, there were a lot of interesting parallel connections between Florida, not parallel, but there were trade links between Florida Jamaica, and Nova Scotia, entirely because all three of these places had a whole bunch of Scottish settlers. These men were major slave owners and slave traders, and they first began the process of clearing the wetlands to expand plantation agriculture. Virginia's slave traders despised these so-called Scottish tobacco lords, which I think might be, connected to why Florida was, during the American Revolution, pretty loyalist. But then, the same people were just as content to stay under Spanish rule. There's one guy I think deserved. Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's interesting to note at this point too that the sort of British administration of the two Floridas was staffed not exclusively but pretty significantly by Scottish people, right? So the first British governor of Eastern Florida was a Scotsman, right? And most of the administrative people that were in charge of like the bureaucracy that existed in East Florida, they were Scotsmen as well. So there's some similarities between Florida and other British possessions that were sort of administered by the Scots.
Oh, totally. And then even in West Florida, there's a great guy named William Dunbar, who's considered the Benjamin Franklin of the South. He was honestly closer to Jefferson because he was a slave owner, but really who fancied himself as this intellectual free thinker. He was a big naturalist. I think a few plants and animals are named after him. And he really brought to the American awareness the existence of the alligator, which of course is now one of the biggest symbols of, the Deep South and especially of Florida.
It's the other college mascot.
Yeah, oh, you're right. I didn't think about that. Yeah, the Gators, yeah. But, most of these Scottish settlers were not necessarily major merchants or major slave owners. They were lower level traders, translators, diplomats, and of course, husbands of Native American women. Often a low status British man could find himself kind of, catapulted in social rank by marrying a Native American woman because many Native American leaders were eager to make marriage alliances with these newcomers, just like we saw centuries earlier with Pedro Menendez and his wife, Lady Antonia. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, a miniature aristocracy of mixed-race merchants and military leaders developed. Most of these people were related to various chiefs on their maternal line and to various Scottish merchants on their paternal lines. So, for instance, the mixed-race Creek leader Alexander McGillivray, who operated out of Pensacola, was related to the famous Creek chief William Weatherford, who battled Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812, but also to William McIntosh, a Creek chief from Georgia who fought alongside Andrew Jackson. McGillivray, who was at one time the most powerful Creek chief and maybe the most powerful man in all of Florida, is a really good case study for this mixed race elite because he was at most only a quarter indigenous. He was legally considered a white guy, and his father was a member of the Georgia legislature. But he was descended from his grandmother from the famous Wind Clan. On his father, he was descended from sanctioned Jacobites who fled Florida. He was able to use his biracial identity to a really great advantage. He established a European-style slave plantation within Creek territory and went to a private school for only white men in South Carolina to get a proper British education. Like Washington and Jefferson, McGillivray used his wealth from slavery to build a massive estate replete with a huge library of scientific and historical books. Yet he fought against the Revolution as a British lieutenant colonel. He also, like many other Creeks and Seminoles at this time, preyed upon Maroon communities to capture slaves. This was a grotesque but very common endeavor among both whites and Native Americans on the Florida frontier. The capture in this kind of reverse Underground Railroad, enslavement of free black people. There's one other guy we really got to mention because he's one of the most interesting Florida men of all time. That is William Augustus Bowles, my favorite of all of these backwoods interlopers. He was a Maryland teenager who joined a loyalist militia during the American Revolution and was sent down to guard remote Pensacola from the Spanish. But before he even saw a Spaniard, Bowles was captured by a group of Creek marauders who decided he was young enough and able enough to be impressed into their ranks. Bowles spent the remainder of the Revolutionary War as an adopted member of the Creek Nation, but was afterwards forced back into British service. While serving as a member of the now greatly reduced British military force in North America after the Revolutionary War, his commanding officers learned about his Muscogee connections. So they sent him back to the frontier into Spanish territory to trade with the Creeks and convince them to ally with the British rather than the ascendant Americans. Across the next 20 years, William Bowles returned to his Muscogee allies and became a major liaison between the British and various Native Americans. He endeared himself to the Muscogee and Hittiche people, as well as the Cherokee, by marrying 2 high-ranking women from both of those tribes. As his influence grew, Bowles became to style himself as less of a British merchant and more of an Indian chief. And when he had to deal with competition from another trading post, the Scottish-owned Panton and Leslie Company, Bowles and his Cherokee father-in-law decided to edge out their rivals by plundering their store. This may have been a savvy business move, but it made Bowles an enemy of both the British, whose subjects owned the store, and the Spanish, who controlled Florida. Deciding it was better to risk his life than his freedom, Bowles declared himself to be the chief of the independent state of Muscogee, a short-lived, self-proclaimed republic in North Florida and South Georgia. After this did not come to pass, he was taken prisoner aboard a Spanish ship. But amazingly, just like the legend of Black Caesar before him, William Bowles took control of this ship and made himself into a pirate, plundering both British and Spanish vessels across the Gulf of Mexico. However, after a short, bright career, he was finally taken prisoner by the Spanish, brought into a Havana prison in 1805. Upon which he managed one last victory, successfully dying in a hunger strike. I really think he's a great figure. I'm surprised he's not more famous. We're kind of wrapping up this episode. Why don't you lead us in to the First Seminole War, which really brings us to the end of colonial Florida and into the American period?
Yeah, so as soon as the United States gets founded in 1776, the U.S. had pretty obvious and sort of natural sort of interest in Florida. The colony was obviously a British possession at the time, and sort of a little known, little discussed aspect of the American Revolution was the attempt to sort of spread the revolution either into Canada, even into like Quebec, but also into Florida. So after the Revolution, during the Second Spanish period, so cracker settlers and their sort of white planter allies, who now were a majority in the region, started to agitate for union with their sort of Anglo brethren in the United States.
Yeah.
And they actually launched a number of sort of unsuccessful uprisings against the Spanish authorities. I think that these should really be conceptualized as sort of part of the broader age of revolution in the Atlantic, right? In the same sort of way that we would think about the American Revolution and Simón Bolívar's campaigns. They were sort of part of this broad Atlantic thrust for liberal governance, right? So a really interesting sort of example of this is that in 1795, residents of Georgia and Florida, white residents of Georgia and Florida, they banded together to try and overthrow the Spanish government in Florida because it was like, monarchical tyranny. They had sort of been whipped up by the French Revolution. And they even took over a fort in what is now modern-day downtown Jacksonville, and they actually raised the French tricolor and declared their allegiance to the French Republic. So it was sort of a very brief outpost of revolutionary France in Florida in modern day Jacksonville, which is sort of, I like to think of that's where I get it from. But the sort of uprising would be put down, but Anglo-American desire for Florida continued throughout the years of the earlier republic.
Yeah. No, we should mention that it was put down largely because most Anglo-Florida settlers were content to remain under the Spanish. However, there was this, this intellectual vanguard, you could say. Yeah, I think that actually the American government had more interest in Florida than Floridians had in the American government for the most part. The Jefferson administration really took great notice in 1801 when the Spanish transferred control of Louisiana back to its original colonizer, France, as part of the complex machinations of the Napoleonic Wars. Thomas Jefferson publicly denounced Napoleon Bonaparte as a tyrant, yet was actually strongly sympathetic to the French cause against the British. He recognized that despite reacquiring Louisiana, the French were largely ambivalent to continental American affairs. Unlike Spain, they had no serious interest in limiting American territorial ambitions. This meant that even before the Louisiana Territory was fully transferred from France to Spain, the American government was already arranging for what would become the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson, however, did have one major misconception. He took for granted that this Louisiana Territory would include East and West Florida. However, when the French explained the Floridas were going to remain in Spanish hands, the American public was chagrined and Jefferson was humiliated. This was a major scandal at the time, with some Federalists demanding that the Republican Jefferson return the Louisiana Purchase, whose settled population were mostly exotic French and Spanish Catholics, and instead annex Florida, whose white residents were mostly familiar Anglo-Protestants. The Federalists insisted that the English-speaking population of Florida yearned for American rule, but this didn't necessarily seem to be the case for the most part. For instance, when a Virginian named Reuben Kemper attempted to seize the West Florida town of Baton Rouge from Spain, he was basically shunned by his fellow English speakers. Instead, Florida would eventually be annexed, not necessarily because of the actions of white Floridian residents, but instead because of the actions of the Maroons and the Seminole. You know how we said that Fort Mose was going to come back? During the War of 1812, the British secretly constructed another fort in Florida on land seized from yet another trader hailing from Scotland. This was done with the consent of the Spanish government in exile, who had recently been forced out of Europe by the broader Napoleonic conflict of this era. The British toyed with using this new fort as a place to launch an invasion of the American South, and also to support their Muscogean allies who, under the leadership of William Weatherford and a strange foreigner named Tecumseh, were waging a fierce battle against the United States in the Creek War. This British invasion never came to pass, yet they began distributing guns to the Creeks and the Seminoles, as well as to escaped African-American slaves, in hopes that this could eventually destabilize American ambitions in the region. The British abandoned their new fort in 1815, due to the end of the War of 1812, as well as the victory of the Americans over the Creeks. This victory was largely due to the tactics of a brash Tennessee general named Andrew Jackson. Jackson's actions were so disruptive to the American Southeast and to its Black and Indigenous residents in particular that when discussing this guy, I think we have to put away our usual aversion to great man history. I don't think Andrew Jackson gives us that much to admire, and much of his career is quite contemptible. But he was certainly a great man in the sense that he dragged a big stick all across American history, leaving scars so deep that they still haven't really healed 2 centuries later. Jackson was a thug, a chauvinist, a racist, even by the standards of his time, but he was also a genuine Democrat, and in one sense of the word, the first Democrat. He absolutely improved the lives of everyday American men, white men at least, but he did so through the plunder and genocide of indigenous peoples. I think Andrew Jackson was the closest thing we have to an American Caesar, and he was, as I like to call him, Orange Julius Caesar. I'm not the first person to make this comparison. John C. Calhoun, possibly the only 19th century Southerner to out-evil Jackson, hated the man and once muttered, "This Caesar ought to have a Brutus." But okay, let's get into Andrew Jackson. Jackson, you want to take us away?
Sure. So, Andrew Jackson was born into a family of Scots-Irish frontier settlers who kind of brought the clannish violence of Ulster and the sort of sectarianism to the hills of Carolina. Jackson was born posthumously and raised by his mother in the most remote part of the British frontier. During the American Revolution, in which his mother and both of his brothers would die, Andrew Jackson became a local celebrity by refusing to polish the boots of a British officer at the age of 14, for which he was slashed with the officer's saber and taken as a prisoner of war. Jackson hated the British for the abuse they suffered on his family, but he also hated the Spanish and the Creek and Cherokee Indians for living on land he believed belonged to American settlers. Jackson had an unexpected sympathy for extremely traditional Native Americans, who he called the people of the forest, but he hated the so-called half-breeds who used European technology and institutions to resist colonial encroachment. In Jackson's mind, the Native Americans had a civilization that may have once been genuinely admirable, but was corrupted by the scheming British and Spanish and had to be cleared away to make room for industrious white Americans.
Yeah, and so years later, he would make this worldview explicitly clear in the 1830 State of the Union. In the monuments and fortifications of an unknown people spread over the extensive regions of the West, we behold the memorials of a once powerful race, which was exterminated or has disappeared to make room for the existing savage tribes. Humanity has often wept over the fate of the Aborigines of this country, and philanthropy has long busily employed in devising means to avert it. But its progress has never for a moment been arrested, and one by one have many powerful tribes disappeared from the earth. One really kind of a funny thing in a dark way about Jackson's career is that he was constantly complaining basically about the libs who were too sympathetic to Native Americans, who didn't realize that, their time was done. And I'm not really sure if you can call him a conservative per se, but Jackson's own rhetoric really does sound a lot like modern American conservatives.
I mean, I wouldn't call it conservative. It's just like, well, too bad. We're stronger. We're going to come take your shit. You can't defend yourself. So
It's social Darwinism, generations before Darwin.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jackson, for obvious reasons, you are probably best equipped to talk about the influence of Andrew Jackson, particularly in Florida. We're kind of wrapping up here, but before we get into the Seminole War, anything you can say about Jackson's influence more broadly?
Yeah, so obviously I have there's a big statue of him in the town where I grew up, and I sort of share some other sort of things with the man, but the...
Yeah, for instance, both of you are Korean.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing that I kind of find interesting about Jackson is that he was kind of America's first, true believer, right? So, Jefferson, talked a pretty big game about, states' rights and, smallholder sort of yeoman liberty and sort of the extension of the government and all that kind of stuff. But when he was actually the president, he, completely jacked the Federalist program. He, bought the Louisiana Purchase, even though it was, understood at the time to kind of be unconstitutional. He really didn't care about his actual principles. It's kind of it's why I kind of hate him a lot, honestly. But Jackson was kind of different. He seemed to genuinely actually believe in the power of the common people as he conceived of it. And that was obviously a deeply sort of evil, racist, sort of misogynistic sort of conception of that. But he really did believe in it. And the other thing, too, is that if there's one thing that most Americans know about Andrew Jackson...
he touched the stove.
Yeah. It's probably that he won the Battle of New Orleans. Maybe that he sort of... just was the president. He's on the $20 bill. But, if they know anything about his actual presidency, it's his war with the bank. And, he seemed to have genuinely believed that there was a conspiracy of financial interests to keep, the common man down. And he was willing to do some really not very smart or well-conceived stuff to thwart that. And he was also willing to do some pretty hair-raising violence and pretty honestly kind of dishonorable sort of backstabbing to his enemies to see his sort of conception of the common people in a more advantageous situation.
Yeah.
So he kind of believed in, and I would argue kind of constructed this sort of idea of America that we sort of understand today, right? This place where there's a lot that is really evil about it, and there's like a lot of sort of these racial and property stratifications of society. But then there's also this idea that like, oh, the common people have like a say in government. Now, that's obviously not true, but it is at least something that like was not part of the American idea until he was around.
Yeah, and then, we talk a lot about like kind of ideological dead ends on this podcast. I think it's kind of fun to see, like, hey, what would happen if like, Christianity took up or whatever. But Jackson is the exact opposite. He's somebody who won possibly more than any other American political figure. Like the terms of debate and the shape of American society was so shaped by the policies of this one guy. It's really astounding.
Yeah, like before Jackson was around, like you could be an open sort of non-democrat in America. Like you didn't have to really appeal to the common people if you didn't want to. Like obviously Hamilton just didn't care about doing that. He didn't like it. He didn't want America to be that way. After Jackson, literally everybody had to at least pretend to have like some conception of the common man in their sort of the pride of place of their sort of politics.
I think you can say Andrew Jackson is the reason every, boomer guy living in a mansion outside St. Louis thinks he's a farmer today.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. The founding father of America B. All right, I'm moving on from that.
We'll do that episode later.
Okay, so let's return back to 1815 to that nameless fort built by the British in Spanish Florida, right on the edge of the American border. One thing we didn't mention is that just before the War of 1812, West Florida was actually purchased by the United States without much fanfare. Anyways, after British troops left the region, the area of that fort became mostly inhabited by Maroons, exactly like Fort Mose a century prior. The Spanish tolerated these black residents to some extent, but also allowed white slave owners to capture any black people they claimed to be their escaped property. In 1816, however, the residents of this fort, the Maroons, struck back against the slave catchers by leading raids against white settlers in both Spanish and U.S. territory. As far as I know, this is the only time of black militias doing raids against, whites. It's really interesting. Jackson was incensed at this brazenness, as well as the inability of Spain to clear this fort. He believed this completely delegitimized the Spanish government's presence in Florida. And thus, knowing full well he lacked any authorization from Congress or the president to launch a foreign war, Andrew Jackson, just like Caesar before him, invaded a foreign land to attack this fort and make a name for himself. Who was going to say no to the hero of the Battle of New Orleans? Thus, the Seminole Wars, which would last until the 1850s, begin with Jackson's assault on the black defenders of this fort. Ironically, the Seminoles are only involved as allies of Andrew Jackson against the Maroons. The 300 defenders of the fort, presumably including women and children, were slaughtered to a man. The alliance between Jackson and the Seminoles, however, was very short-lived. When Americans discovered the presence of British agents in Florida, as well as British guns and uniforms in Seminole villages, a shooting war erupted between the Seminoles and the British Army. Jackson deputized local Creek peoples, led by a part Scottish chief named William McIntosh, to attack Seminole towns in both Spanish and American parts of Florida. After 3 years of campaigning across Spanish territory, Jackson had convinced the Spaniards that Florida was no longer worth defending. The Seminole War was won, and in 1819, the Spanish and American agents signed the Adams-O'Neese Treaty, granting the entirety of the Florida Peninsula to the United States. Andrew Jackson and his beloved wife Rachel went down to Pensacola to watch the Spanish bandera be lowered for the last time, having flown over Florida on and off for 300 years. Jackson was still a decade away from becoming president, yet he was already Florida's final conquistador. All right. And so that right there, that is the end of, centuries and centuries of colonial Florida history. But the European conquest of Florida, now the, American conquest of Florida, was really only just beginning. And we're going to get all into that and continue our discussion of Andrew Jackson in the next episode. Sam, Jackson, thank you for being here, you guys. Anything you two, any comments you'd like to add before we wrap up?
It's my podcast. I'm supposed to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited for the next episode where we finally get to talk about the sort of the future megalopolis that will sort of be encompass the entire American East Coast of Jacksonville.
Yes. I think.
Yeah, I'm just really excited because this is we got up to the point where the part of Florida history that we actually covered in history class in high school, and the rest is just a mystery to me. So now it's it feels like I'm going into the sequel, and I'm prepared. I'm on the edge of my seat.
Yep. All right. Well, yeah. Well, listen, we'll be back up soon with our with episode part 2, going into the Second Seminole War, which really is the big one, and the continuing history of American penetration down the Florida Peninsula. All right, well, take it easy, drink some orange juice. Thank you all for listening. This has been Gladio Free Europe, signing off.
All right, nice.
Fresh fish this morning, ladies. They are gilded with gold, and you may find a diamond in their mouths. They are just from the river St. John, St. John's. They are just from the river St. John's. They are just from the river St. John, St. John's. They are just from the river St. John.